The very moment a medal clattered onto the steel floor, an entire room full of warriors knew they were standing before a man whose honor he had spent decades trying to bury. That morning held nothing out of the ordinary for the silver-haired man named Daniel Hayes. He was simply an elderly volunteer who had come to the naval base to deliver a canvas bag containing groceries and a few supplies for the mess hall kitchen. For him, this day was like every day before. Quietly stepping in, nodding to the younger personnel, doing his work, and silently slipping away like an unnoticed gray shadow. But everything changed the instant he stepped into the center of the dining room, filled with laughter and the clash of silverware, where the young soldiers believed that age turned a man into a punchline. A young Navy SEAL suddenly jumped up, flashing a subtly unpleasant smile, and called out, "Hey, old-timer, what rank did you hold back in the day?" His entire table erupted in laughter, seeing it as a harmless tease. Daniel didn't answer. He simply tightened his grip on the strap of the bag and intended to move on. But fate needed no words to speak. The strap was frayed, the stitching strained, and in a moment of cruel irony, it tore open. A heavy, metallic object tumbled out of the bag's mouth, hit the floor, and made a sharp, cold sound that caused people several tables away to look up. The noise in the room instantly died. The eyes of the SEALs shifted from mockery to confusion, then to an almost stunned disbelief. A round, small metal, yet instantly recognizable to anyone who had heard the legends of the battlefield, spun slowly on the steel surface, like a destiny deliberately introducing itself. And as it came to a stop right in front of the boot of the soldier who had mocked him, the entire room fell into absolute silence. An older soldier at a corner table shot up, his face ashen. He whispered, "No way! That's the top-secret combat life. Saving medal." Another man spoke softly, as if afraid of waking something. "Only a few dozen people in the entire country have been awarded one." Then, no one spoke again. Daniel bent down, picked up the medal with a slightly trembling hand, but his gaze was as calm as still water. He didn't look at anyone. He just tucked the object back into the ripped canvas bag and walked out of the room like a man who had accidentally dropped the secret of another era. On the drive home, Daniel gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. He didn't want the memories to be pulled up, but they began flooding his mind like an unstoppable torrent. He had spent his entire life hiding that medal because it didn't represent victory. It carried the one thing he never wanted to look at again: failure, spilled blood, screams, and an unfulfilled duty. He wanted to live the rest of his life as an ordinary man. But when the medal struck the steel floor under the gaze of those young soldiers, he understood that the past never truly relinquishes a survivor. When he arrived home, Daniel placed the canvas bag on the kitchen counter. His house was small and simple, bearing no trace of the life he once lived on the battlefield. He dared not open the bag. Instead, he stood by the window, his hands clenched into fists, trying to quell the tremor in his chest. Over the years, he had grown accustomed to the quiet life. Used to the friendly greetings of his neighbors, used to gardening, fixing the fence, brewing his coffee every morning, and trying to forget the faces left behind in the places he had passed through. But the medal had never truly vanished from his life. It had only been sleeping, waiting for the day to be awakened by the exact kind of person Daniel feared the most, the innocent who liked to test the limits of another man's memory. He opened the bag, took the medal, and turned it over in his palm. The medal reflected the faint light from the kitchen lamp, but remained completely cold. It felt like stone. It was a witness to the fateful night he had always tried to forget. Daniel gritted his teeth, set the medal aside, and let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire exhausted soul. This was not a symbol of glory. It symbolized that he had survived, while others had not. As he struggled to clear his mind, the past took him back to his childhood. Daniel grew up in a poor family in a suburban area of the Midwest. His father was a veteran whose eyes always seemed to be looking at a place far beyond the room they were standing in. He rarely spoke, rarely smiled, and whenever Daniel asked about the war, he would only reply with the phrase, "All you need to know is contained in 2 words. Stay silent." Daniel didn't understand it then, but he quickly learned that silence was all that was left when a man carried something that couldn't be buried. By the age of 19, Daniel had no choice but to enlist. No money for school, no opportunities, no one to rely on. The military was the only path. He entered without a dream, without pride, only the need to survive. Basic training taught him how to be a man before it taught him how to be a soldier. He learned how to endure, how not to run, how to keep his breath steady in the dark. An instructor once told him, "The ones who want to be heroes usually die first." Daniel replied, "I just want to live." The instructor looked at him for a long moment and nodded, as if seeing something Daniel himself had never seen within. After the incident at the base, Daniel tried to return to normal life. But rumors spread faster than the wind. The next morning, a commander from the base called him. The man's voice was full of respect, almost timid. "Mr. Hayes, we were hoping to speak with you privately." Daniel refused, saying shortly, "No need." The commander hesitated. "Men who hold that medal often have a story the world wants to hear." Daniel replied, "The world doesn't want to hear my story." Then he hung up. By noon, a young cook chased after him in the parking lot. His face was filled with sincerity. "Sir, how did you earn that medal?" Daniel paused, looked into the boy's still innocent eyes, and said, "I just stood in the wrong place at the right time." The boy didn't understand. Daniel didn't want him to understand. Only those who have seen hell and returned know the truth behind a medal. That evening, Daniel went down to the storage room in the basement. An old iron trunk sat in the corner, dusty but still locked. He opened it, and memories immediately flared up like fire hitting gasoline. Inside the trunk were yellowed letters, ripped fragments of military uniforms, and a few photographs of a group of 5 men. 5 men who had once called each other brothers. 4 faces in the photo were circled in red. The only face not circled was Daniel's. He picked up the photo, tracing the lost faces with his finger. A deep pang shot through his chest. "You guys are the ones who deserve the medal," he whispered. His voice was dry, like desert soil. He put the photo down, slammed the trunk shut with a deliberate finality that restrained his tremors. He knew very well. The memory of them was the only thing he never wanted to lose, but it was also the thing that made him almost die every time he remembered. The next day, the atmosphere at the base was different. The soldiers who once laughed now walked slower whenever he appeared. A few greeted him, as if acknowledging a legend. Others watched him as if trying to guess what kind of darkness a survivor carried. Honor always comes with fear, and Daniel understood that better than anyone. In the afternoon, an email appeared in his inbox. The sender was a retired officer Daniel hadn't been in close contact with for years. The subject read, "Heard the news." Daniel didn't open it. When his phone rang, he didn't want to answer either. But the call repeated 3 times, forcing him to pick up. "Daniel, there's something." The officer's voice was hoarse. "I heard someone saw your medal." Daniel was silent. The officer continued, "You need to know this. Someone, from that night, is looking for you." Daniel nearly dropped the phone. "It can't be," he whispered. "No one survived." The officer replied, "I thought so too, but he said you would understand the message." Daniel tried to catch his breath. "What message?" The officer answered, "He said, it's time for the truth to be told again." Daniel hung up. His head was filled with a loud ringing, like waves crashing against a cliff. He grabbed a chair and sat down, as if his legs could no longer hold him. If one person survived, then everything he had believed for years was a lie. His survival was not the end. It was only the beginning of a chain of unanswered questions. That evening, Daniel sat alone on his porch. The streetlights illuminated his face with a fatigue so deep it was hard to name. The memory of the fateful night returned like an old storm. The smell of smoke, gunshots, a bloody hand trying to grasp his. A cry of his name drowned out by an explosion. That hand slipped from his just before the fire swallowed everything. Daniel closed his eyes, whispering in the darkness, "I'm sorry." Those 3 words were the shadow that had followed him throughout his life. When he stood up to go inside, he saw a white envelope lying right by the door. No sender name, no postmark. Daniel picked it up, opened it, and found a photograph. The exact same photo he kept in the trunk in the basement. 5 soldiers standing side by side, but this time a bold, black X marked the face of a man Daniel never thought he would see again. Below the photo was a line handwritten in a shaky but intense script. "We need to talk, before the truth dies one more time." Daniel stood motionless for nearly a minute, only hearing the pounding of his heart in his chest. He brought the photo closer to the light, trying to find a clue. And at that exact moment, he saw the thing that made his entire body go cold. In the corner of the picture, there was a smudge of dry mud, imprinted with a faint fingerprint, but clear enough for Daniel to know whose it was. It belonged to a man who should have died in the fire all those years ago. Daniel let go, the photo falling to the wooden floor, and he stepped back as he realized that the man with that fingerprint was returning not to accuse, but to pull him into a truth even more brutal than death. Every door of memory Daniel had tried to lock burst open at once when he realized the man with that fingerprint could not possibly be alive unless the most horrific thing that night had never been correctly told. Daniel stood in the living room, the weak yellow light reflecting off the fallen picture on the floor. His body was frozen rigid, but his mind spun at a speed that stole his breath. Each heartbeat was like a hammer striking metal. The photograph was no longer just an old snapshot. It was a message, a warning, a proof. The man he believed dead was sending a signal back. And that meant someone had lied years ago. Or worse, Daniel himself had misread the truth in the moment that blood and fire covered his eyes. He bent down, picking up the photo with both hands, trying to keep them steady. The dry mud fingerprint could not be fake. It was a mark Daniel had seen hundreds of times when that man touched his weapon, his straps, or the shoulder of a comrade to pull them to safety. A fingerprint Daniel thought was buried under sand, ash, and pain. If he were truly alive, why hadn't he contacted him for all these years? Why let Daniel shoulder the sentence of self-reproach alone in the dark? Why let him live as the only one left to remember those cruel memories? The relentless questions forced Daniel to sit down on the chair. His breathing was ragged. His hands gripped the edge of the table as if trying to keep himself from sinking to the bottom of the ocean. The past wasn't just returning. It was pulling him under like a fierce current. A current carrying 4 names he swore he would never let fade. But if one survived, could it be that the other 3 died for a reason he had never known? Daniel stood up and headed to the basement. He opened the iron trunk where things that should never be touched were kept. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the original photo. In the original, the man who was X'd out in the new photo was the one who had always told Daniel, "Where I go, you follow." He was the one who always led every mission. He was the one who never left a comrade behind. He was the one Daniel had seen fall right before his eyes. He felt something catch in his throat. "It can't be you," Daniel whispered. "No way." His phone vibrated. A text message from an unknown number. "Meet me tonight. Tell no one. If you don't come, everything you think you know will be buried forever." Below it was the location, an abandoned warehouse about 3 miles from town. Daniel stared at the screen for a long time. He knew exactly what he was facing. This invitation wasn't a casual reunion. It was a summons pulling him into the place he feared most, the truth. He didn't want to go back to the moment he lost his 4 brothers. But now, he couldn't turn away. Not when a man marked as dead was sending a letter from the darkness. Daniel grabbed his jacket, tucking the metal into his pocket with a strange, immediate reflex, and walked outside. Getting into the car, his hands were slightly shaking, but his gaze was sharp and cold. He was no longer the gentle old man in the quiet kitchen. He was the soldier who had survived the final night of the war. The road leading out of the neighborhood was unremarkable, but Daniel saw every shadow along the way as fragments of memory observing him, waiting to see what he would do next. Approaching the warehouse, Daniel stopped the car far away to avoid being detected. He walked lightly under the darkness. The night wind wasn't strong, but it was enough to rustle the dry leaves beneath his feet. The warehouse door was slightly ajar, just enough for a thin beam of light to escape. Daniel paused for a few seconds, placing a hand on his chest, forcing himself to stay calm. The silence was so profound he could hear his own heart beating. Then, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The inside was nearly empty, save for a few old wooden crates and a thick layer of dust covering the floor. A single light bulb hung on the wall, its dull yellow light flickering slightly. Daniel walked slowly around the room until he heard a small sound behind him. He turned, but saw no one. Just then, the door slammed shut. Daniel instinctively jumped aside with the reflex of an old soldier. His breath was shallow, his hands ready for defense. A deep voice echoed from the darkness to his left. "You're still as fast as ever." Daniel froze. His heart hammered so hard he felt his chest vibrate. That voice, it was intensely familiar. So familiar it resurrected everything he wanted to forget. But familiar didn't mean safe. Daniel squinted into the gloom. "Show yourself," he said, his voice low but steady. "If you truly are who I think you are." The shadow moved. A man stepped out, taller and thinner than before, with longer hair, a stubbled beard, and a face so ravaged by time he would be unrecognizable if not for his eyes. Those eyes were the one thing Daniel could never forget. The eyes of a man who had once saved Daniel from both death and himself. Daniel couldn't breathe for a few seconds. He heard the rush of blood in his ears. "Elias?" he said, the name leaving his mouth like a prayer. The man nodded. "It's me." Daniel stepped back. "You died. I saw—" But Elias raised a hand. "No. You only saw what you were allowed to see." Daniel stiffened. "Allowed? What does that mean?" Elias looked at him, his eyes as deep as an abyss. There are truths not meant for a survivor's ears. That day, someone decided you didn't need to know the whole story. Daniel felt his heart constrict. Why are you showing up now? Elias looked down at his own hands. Because now they're looking for you. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Who? Elias answered in a hoarse, strained voice. The people who orchestrated our deaths. Daniel stood still, as if struck directly in the past. He tried to think, but his head spun. However, Elias took another step and spoke slowly, word for word. Daniel, that night was not a surprise attack. It was a staged mission, and we were nothing but sacrificial lambs. Daniel was staggered. No, that's impossible. Elias moved closer. Did you think what we were carrying that day was just communications gear? Did you think we were sent to save civilians? No, Daniel. We were sent carrying something the military didn't want anyone to know about. And when the situation went south, Elias paused, his eyes darkening. They planned to bury us along with the secret. Daniel felt the ground disappear beneath him. Years of self-reproach for failing to save his comrades shattered into fragments of broken glass. You mean to tell me we were betrayed? Elias nodded. Betrayed by the very people who gave the orders. Daniel leaned against the wall to keep from falling. In his mind's eye, he saw the faces of the dead. They hadn't just died on a mission. They died because of a deliberate lie. Daniel clenched his jaw. Then how were you alive? Elias opened his jacket, revealing a long scar running from his chest down his abdomen. I didn't deserve to live. I lived because they thought I was dead. A group of locals pulled me out before the cleanup crew arrived. Daniel frowned. Cleanup crew? Elias met his gaze. To erase the traces. Outside the warehouse, the sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed. Elias looked toward the door. They're here. Daniel tensed up. Who? Elias merely whispered. The ones who want you silent, just as they once wanted me silent. Someone violently pulled the warehouse door from the outside. The light in the room flickered. Elias shoved Daniel into a corner. We can't let them catch you. Daniel replied. I don't run. Elias gripped his shoulder. If you're caught, the truth will disappear with you. The door was hit hard again. Dust fell from the ceiling. Daniel clenched his fists, his eyes shifting from stunned disbelief to fierce determination. The two men stood in the darkness waiting. Elias whispered, Listen to me. The exit is in the back. Daniel asked. What about you? Elias offered a grim smile. I came here to end the loop. You came here to keep living. A small explosion rang out, blasting the metal door inward. As the smoke and dust cleared, Daniel saw the silhouettes of two armed men stepping through the doorway, and Elias softly spoke a sentence Daniel would never forget. Don't trust anyone who ever gave us an order. The first thing Daniel understood when the door blew inward was not that he might die, but that someone had spent a very long time preparing for this moment. The door did not simply open, it folded inward with a hard metallic crack, as if the night itself had swung a sledgehammer. Dust poured from the ceiling. The light flickered once, then steadied into a sick yellow halo around the entrance. Two figures stepped through the frame, silhouettes against the darkness outside, each holding a weapon, low but ready. They did not shout. They did not warn. They moved like men who believed the room already belonged to them. Daniel felt his body revert to old programming before his mind caught up. His feet slid sideways, eyes tracking the angles, breath slowing instead of speeding. He did not think about his age or his aches. He thought about distance, cover, and time. Elias raised one hand, barely. A small movement that meant stay. The gesture was the same as it had been decades ago on another night, under a different roof, before everything burned. The first man stepped further into the light. He wore civilian clothes that did not quite fit the way a normal man wears them. His shoulders were too structured, his stance too disciplined. There was no mistaking the training in his posture. The second man stayed closer to the doorway, scanning corners with a quiet patience that made Daniel's neck tighten. These were not random thugs. They were professionals, or something worse. Soldiers pretending not to be soldiers. Empty, the first man said quietly over his shoulder, though his eyes kept moving. Should be, anyway. Elias spoke from the shadowed corner, his voice calm in a way that made Daniel both grateful and furious. You are late. The two men froze. Their heads turned in unison. They had expected a target, not a conversation. The one near the door adjusted his grip on the weapon. You have been busy, Elias, he replied. His tone carried the faint, flat edge of someone who knew the name very well. Running from a ghost for this many years. At the sound of his name spoken like that, Elias's jaw tightened. Daniel glanced at him. An entire history existed between these men that Daniel had not been told. The realization carved a new line of anger into his chest. "Step into the light," the first man ordered, ignoring Daniel as if he were an afterthought, a harmless extra in someone else's movie. "Both of you." Elias smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. He stepped forward slowly, and Daniel followed, choosing to stand half a pace behind, not hiding, but not presenting himself as the primary focus. The men at the door took in the sight of them, their faces unreadable. Then the one who had spoken first let out a very small breath, as though something had been confirmed. "So it is true," he said. "You pulled him out of his quiet little life after all." Daniel frowned. "You know who I am?" The man's eyes slid to him, cool and dismissive. "We know exactly who you are, Mr. Hayes. You are the man who would not ask questions when they told him to forget. A very rare quality." The words landed like a blow. Daniel's mouth went dry. They knew his name, his life, his silence, which meant someone had been watching him for a very long time. Elias took a step forward, placing himself slightly between Daniel and the men. "We are not here to play," Elias said. "You know why I contacted him. You know why he has to remember." The second man finally spoke. His voice was softer, but more dangerous. "He does not need to remember. He needs to remain quiet. The past is stable right now. No one is asking questions. No one is complaining. Why disturb a grave that is finally still?" Daniel stared at them, realization spreading like cold water through his veins. "You are not here to kill us," he said slowly. "You are here to keep us under control." The first man tilted his head. "Death is a kind of control. Silence is another." He shrugged. "We are flexible." It was Elias who moved first. Not with a weapon, not with violence, but with words. "Tell him," Elias said, jerking his chin slightly toward Daniel. "Tell him who signed the order that sent us into that village. Tell him who approved the payload we carried. Tell him what we were really doing there that night." The room seemed to tighten. The first man's expression did not change, but something in his eyes closed. "He does not have the clearance for that information," he said. Daniel laughed once, a sound too sharp for such a tired body. "Clearance?" he repeated. "I watched men burn because of that mission. I held one of them while he died. I have been clearing that night out of my head for decades. I think I have earned the right to hear the truth." The second man lifted his weapon a fraction. "You have earned the right to remain a civilian and enjoy what remains of your years. Do not trade that for questions you will not like the answers to." Elias stepped aside then, leaving Daniel fully exposed. It was a subtle act of trust, or a cruel test. Daniel could not tell. "Choose," Elias said quietly. "Do you want the quiet lie or the loud truth?" They all looked at Daniel. The two intruders, Elias, even the dust hanging in the light beams seemed to pause. In that moment, Daniel understood that everything that followed would be born from his next sentence. He could walk away. He could pretend not to care. He could let the official version of that night stand unchallenged. Keep his small house, his volunteer work, his thin peace. Or he could rip open a wound that someone with power had spent a lot of energy sewing shut. He thought of the medal. He thought of the 5 faces in the photograph. 4 circled. 1 left bare. He thought of the times he woke up at 3 in the morning with his shirt soaked in sweat, hearing the same cry over and over in his ears. "I want the truth," Daniel said. His voice did not shake. Even if it came 30 years too late. For the first time, the first man looked almost tired. "Very well," he said. "Here is a small piece of it." He took one breath, as if steadying himself. "The night of the operation, your unit was not carrying communications equipment to stabilize the local network. You were transporting a prototype device, something that had to cross that border without any official record. Something that certain people did not trust airplanes for." Daniel felt his stomach twist. "What kind of device?" he asked. The man looked at him steadily. "The kind that makes it very easy to erase an enemy." He paused. "Or a group of inconvenient allies." The air in the warehouse thickened. The walls seemed to lean in. Daniel stared at him, and suddenly fragments of that night took on a new shape. The extra weight in the transport, the unusual tension on the radio, the odd silence from command just before everything went wrong. "You are saying," Daniel's voice trailed off, "you are saying we were carrying a weapon." "A prototype," the man corrected. "One that needed field conditions, one that needed plausible deniability. And when things went bad," Elias added, voice low, "they decided it would be better if everyone there died. No survivors, no testimonies, no messy questions about why a small unit was carrying something that should never even have existed on paper. The second man glanced at Elias with annoyance. "You talk too much," he muttered. Daniel took a step toward them. "Why did you spare me?" The first man shook his head. "We did not spare you. You were a statistical error. You were supposed to die with the rest. When reports came back that someone had survived, the easiest path was to fold you into the official story. Bravery under fire, exceptional leadership, a rare medal, a neat little ribbon to tie over a very ugly box." A bitter taste rose in Daniel's mouth. "So I spent my entire life hating myself for not saving them, and you spent your life, what, watching me?" The second man gave a faint smile. "Not personally, but yes. Someone always kept track. A survivor with that kind of honor attached to his name is a dangerous thing if he ever starts asking the wrong questions." Elias stepped closer to Daniel, shoulder barely touching his. "Now do you understand?" he asked. "This is why I vanished. This is why they let you live only as long as you did not look back." The first man glanced at his watch, then at the door. "This conversation has gone on long enough. Mr. Hayes, here is what you are going to do. You are going to go home. You are going to pretend this meeting never happened. You are going to keep your comfortable silence, and in return, no one will bother you again. That is the end of it." Daniel stared at him. Then he looked at Elias. Then he thought of the cook at the base, the young one who had asked how he got the medal. He thought of the light in the boy's eyes, the faith he still had in the idea that the people above him were worthy of trust. "That is not the end of it," Daniel said quietly. "If I walk away now, then the only story left standing is the lie, and the lie is what killed them." The second man exhaled sharply. "This is not a movie, Mr. Hayes. There is no courtroom confession at the end. There is no parade of justice. There is only quiet damage done in quiet rooms." Daniel shook his head. "Then I will find my own room," he said, "and I will not keep it quiet." The first man's eyes hardened. The polite, weary facade disappeared. What remained was pure calculation. "Then we have a problem," he said. Elias moved before the next breath finished. He grabbed one of the old wooden crates with a force that ignored his scars, yanked it backward, and kicked out a loose panel behind it. "Now!" he barked. Daniel did not think. He moved. Shots exploded through the space where he had been standing a heartbeat earlier. The sound was deafening in the confined warehouse. Splinters burst from crates. A light bulb shattered, throwing half the room into shadow. Elias pushed Daniel through the narrow gap behind the crate, following him into a dark, low corridor that smelled of dust and oil. They ran bent over, boots thudding against concrete. Behind them, muffled shouts echoed, more gunfire, then the scrape of boots as the men pursued. Daniel's lungs burned, but the old training woke fully now. Every step, every turn, every decision was filtered through a simple, brutal desire. Survive long enough to make this truth mean something. "Where does this lead?" Daniel gasped. "Service tunnel," Elias replied, breath ragged. "Out to the old rail yard. If they blocked it, we improvise." Several yards ahead, a faint rectangle of lighter darkness appeared. An exit. Elias slowed, motioning for Daniel to hug the wall. "They will expect us to go straight out," he whispered. "So we do not." He pointed to a rusty maintenance ladder leading up into even deeper shadow. "We go high, we watch, we think." They climbed. The metal groaned, but held. At the top, they emerged into a narrow catwalk above the yard, barely wide enough for one person. Below, the rail spurs stretched out like ribs. The main door of the tunnel stood ahead, a black mouth framed by dim security lights. As they watched, the two men from the warehouse burst out, scanning the yard with their weapons up, shouting into radios Daniel could not hear. "They will bring more," Elias said. "They will sweep the town if they have to. They cannot afford to let you talk." Daniel pressed his back against the wall, muscles trembling. "Then we make it too expensive to silence me," he said. "We make noise they cannot smother." Elias looked at him, studying his face. "You are not the same man I left dying on that floor," he said quietly. "Back then, all you wanted was to save us. Now you want to save the story." Daniel's voice was hoarse when he answered, "I could not save you. I will not fail the truth, too." Elias gave a short nod. "Then the first step is this. You cannot go back to your house." The words landed heavier than gunfire. "My house?" Daniel said. "They know where you live. They have probably already entered. By the time you get there, anything that proves what really happened will be gone. Or worse, they will be waiting for you." Elias looked down at the two men moving through the yard below. "From this moment, you are not a quiet old volunteer. You are a loose end." Daniel pictured his kitchen, the table where he had spread out the photograph, the basement with the steel footlocker, the worn letters, The original picture of 5 men in the desert. The footlocker, he whispered. My records. My letters. Everything is in there. Elias turned his head toward him. Then you understand how much time we do not have. Below them, one of the men spoke into his radio and pointed toward the road leading into town. The other nodded and headed for a dark sedan parked near the fence. The message was clear enough. The hunt had already left the warehouse behind. Daniel watched the car pull away, taillights glowing red. The town he had thought of as safe, ordinary, harmless, now felt like a trap he had built with his own hands. Every neighbor, every friendly wave, every familiar corner had been observed by someone he never saw. What do we do? Daniel asked. Elias leaned in, lowering his voice until it was almost a growl. We go where people still listen, he said. But before that, we retrieve whatever they have not taken from your house. That footlocker may hold the only pieces of proof we can trust. Daniel swallowed. You just said I cannot go back. You cannot go back as yourself, Elias answered. But you can go back as someone who understands the risk. He paused, then added with a bitter twist to his mouth. And this time, you do not go alone. For a long moment, they stood in the dark, listening to distant engines fade. Then Elias started moving along the catwalk, leading Daniel toward a ladder on the far side of the yard. Where are we going? Daniel asked. To prepare, Elias said. Because once we step onto your street again, the line between quiet honor and open war will disappear. The wind picked up, carrying with it a smell of rust and old smoke. Daniel followed, each step feeling like a choice he could never undo. Somewhere behind them, the echo of that first metal hitting the mess hall floor seemed to ring again. It was as if the world itself had been trying to tell him something that day. Not about glory, not about pride, about the simple, brutal cost of finally telling the truth. And as he climbed down toward the next phase of a life he never wanted, one thought burned brightest in his mind. If the men who died that night had been used as pieces in a game, then the least he could do now was flip the board. At the edge of the rail yard, as they prepared to vanish into the dark, Daniel's phone vibrated a single new message flashing on the screen from an unknown number, containing nothing but a photograph of his house with the front door already standing open. The photograph of Daniel's front door standing open felt less like a warning and more like a countdown he had unknowingly started the moment the metal hit the floor. Daniel stared at the message on his phone as he and Elias moved through the shadows outside the old rail yard. The picture was recent, taken no more than a few minutes earlier, judging by the sky's faint glow on his porch. It meant someone had already entered his home, possibly searching, possibly waiting. Elias leaned over, studying the picture with sharp, tired eyes, and whispered, They move faster than expected. They want to end this tonight. Daniel felt his heart throb with the heavy rhythm of dread, but he did not turn back. The truth had chased him long enough. Now he was finally chasing it. They slipped through the service alley behind the industrial district, avoiding streetlights and intersections. Daniel's mind replayed every object in his house that could connect him to the night of the mission. The letters, the torn uniform patches, the photograph, and especially the steel footlocker buried in the basement. Losing those meant losing the last real proof he had. Elias walked beside him with confident strides, despite the limp in his left leg, a reminder of the wound that should have ended his life. Listen, Elias said quietly. Inside your house they will not shoot unless they have no choice. They want silence, not chaos. Use that. Daniel nodded, but part of him doubted that silence was still their priority. When they approached Daniel's neighborhood, the air seemed wrong. It was too still, too careful, as if someone had pressed pause on the world. The houses sat quietly under the streetlights, windows dark, lawns trimmed, everything peaceful except for the knowledge that danger waited behind one of those doors. From a distance, Daniel spotted his house, and even from the far end of the street he could see the shape of the front door tilted inward. Elias positioned himself behind a parked car and lifted 2 fingers. We watch first, he said. If we rush in, we die ignorant. They observed for several minutes. A shadow moved past the window in Daniel's living room. Then another. 2 men at least, maybe 3. They were not rifling through drawers. They moved with deliberate pacing, searching for something specific. Daniel clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar ache of fear that he had carried since the night the mission went wrong. They already found the living room, he said under his breath. If they go downstairs, the footlocker, Elias cut him off. Then we go in before they reach it. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and added, But we go smart. They circled to the back of the house. The back gate was slightly ajar, not broken, just nudged open. A subtle sign that professionals had passed through. Daniel swallowed hard. They slipped along the side of the house and crouched beneath the kitchen window. Daniel peeked inside and saw a man standing near the sink, speaking quietly into an earpiece. He was not searching, he was guarding. That meant the real work was happening somewhere else inside. Elias leaned close and whispered, "If he is on comms, the team is split. Basement is likely compromised." Daniel felt something twist inside him. The basement was where his truth lived. They moved to the back door. Elias pressed his ear against the wood. After a moment, he nodded. Only one in the kitchen. He took a slow breath. We remove him silently. Daniel felt a flash of old instincts clicking into place. The same instincts he thought had died with his unit. He and Elias counted down silently with their fingers. 3, 2, 1. Elias shoved the door open, and Daniel grabbed the guard from behind before the man could complete a single word into his radio. Elias struck the man's wrist, knocking the weapon away, and Daniel forced him to the floor, holding him until his resistance faded. They dragged the unconscious guard behind the counter. Elias knelt beside him, checking his pockets. "Secure team," Elias whispered. "Means more are somewhere nearby. We move fast." Daniel nodded and stepped toward the basement door. His hand shook as he gripped the handle. He imagined the footlocker lying open, papers scattered, secrets disappearing into pockets that belonged to men who had permission to make anything vanish. Elias placed a hand on Daniel's forearm. "Together," he said. "No one faces the past alone." They descended the stairs slowly. Each step creaked under their weight. At the bottom, a faint light flickered from the workshop area. The basement smelled of dust, oil, and the faint metallic scent of disturbed belongings. Daniel felt cold dread spreading through his stomach. When they reached the final step, they saw the footlocker. It stood in the middle of the room, wide open, its contents spread across the floor like the aftermath of a robbery. A man knelt in front of it, flipping through Daniel's letters with a cold efficiency. Another stood watch near the far wall, with a suppressed weapon angled downward, ready for anything. Daniel felt something snap inside him. The letters were from men who never came home. They were the last voices of brothers who had trusted him. Seeing a stranger handling them felt like desecration. Elias saw the rage building in Daniel's eyes and whispered, "Wait. Breathe. Then strike." Daniel forced a single breath through clenched teeth, then moved with a controlled anger that surprised even him. Elias created a diversion by knocking over a metal tool tray. The loud crash echoed through the basement, and the guard near the wall swung his weapon toward the noise. Daniel used the moment. He rushed forward, grabbing the man's arm and driving him into the concrete column. The suppressed weapon clattered to the floor. Elias launched himself at the man near the footlocker, tackling him hard enough to send papers flying like dull white sparks. The two intruders fought back with well-trained fury, but Elias moved with the desperation of someone who had already survived death once. Daniel held onto the man he was fighting, forcing the weapon away and slamming him down with the strength of decades of buried grief. When the struggle ended, both intruders lay unconscious. Elias caught his breath, leaning against the workbench. Daniel knelt beside the footlocker, touching the scattered letters with trembling hands. Some were torn, some were stained by footprints, but they were still here. Still real. Still his. Elias crouched beside him and whispered, "There are more coming." They did not send only 4 men for something this important. Daniel looked up, eyes darkening with a resolve Elias had not seen since the night of their last mission. "Then we take what we need and leave," Daniel said. "We protect what they tried to bury." Working quickly, they gathered the most important items. The original photograph, the letters, and a worn notebook filled with coordinate logs from the mission. Elias took a final glance around the basement and muttered, "They will burn this house once we are gone." Daniel froze. "What?" Elias met his gaze. "That is how they erase loose ends." Upstairs, a car engine rumbled to a stop outside. Then another. Doors slammed. Boots approached the porch with disciplined rhythm. Daniel stuffed the last documents into a small bag. Elias seized his arm and whispered fiercely, "There is no back exit they do not know. We go through the only place they never expect up." Daniel followed Elias up the stairs, but instead of heading toward the front or back, Elias pointed upward to the attic entrance. They climbed into the narrow attic just as the front door burst open. Voices filled the house, flashlights cut through the rooms. Daniel and Elias crawled across the beams, careful not to make a sound. The attic was cramped, hot, and dangerous, but it was high ground, and high ground was a soldier's last refuge. Daniel held the bag of documents close, feeling every memory inside it press against his chest like a heartbeat. Below them, the search began. One voice said, "The basement is clear." Another replied, Find them. Orders from above. No survivors. Daniel's pulse throbbed in his temples. Elias gestured toward the small attic vent overlooking the backyard. We wait until they move to the basement, he whispered. Then we take the roof. As Daniel crawled closer to the vent, he caught a glimpse of 3 more men entering the house. They carried equipment bags. They were not here to search. They were here to finish something. Elias whispered, They brought charges. They are preparing to level your home. Daniel looked at the faces below, professionals carrying out an order they never questioned, and realized that everything he once believed about loyalty had been built on sand. Elias leaned closer, his voice barely audible. Once the charges are set, the house becomes a coffin. We have minutes. Daniel gripped the bag tighter, knowing what was coming next. On my signal, Elias said, we go through the roof. Daniel's breath caught. The roof? Drop to where? Elias stared through the vent. Anywhere that is not here. Voices below grew louder. Footsteps moved toward the basement door. Someone said, Plant them fast. Command wants this done before the hour turns. Elias raised 3 fingers. Daniel steadied his breath. 2 fingers. The sound of hardware clinking below. 1 finger. As Elias lowered his final finger, a sudden, unfamiliar voice echoed from downstairs, calm, authoritative, and devastatingly recognizable. Stand down. I want Hayes alive. The moment Daniel heard the voice downstairs, every instinct in his body screamed that the most dangerous man in the house was not holding a weapon, he was holding the truth. Daniel froze beneath the attic beams as the unmistakable voice carried through the air. It was calm, deliberate, and heavy with the kind of authority that made trained men stop moving. Elias looked at Daniel with a mixture of dread and recognition, and for the first time since reappearing, Elias's confidence broke. The men in the living room immediately halted their movements. One of them responded, Sir, we thought the order was containment. The voice replied smoothly, The order has changed. I want Hayes alive. The other one, optional. Daniel felt a cold wave pass through his spine as he realized Elias had just been reclassified as expendable. Elias gestured silently toward the roof exit, but Daniel shook his head. Leaving now meant losing the one person who might know the entire truth. Staying meant risking the person downstairs who had just put a price on their lives. Elias whispered, That voice belongs to only one man, and if he is here personally, this goes deeper than we thought. Daniel clenched his jaw. Who is he? Elias exhaled slowly, as if forcing air through a wound. Colonel Mason Kade. Daniel recognized the name like a ghost recognizing its own shadow. Kade had been the commanding officer overseeing their mission decades ago. Daniel thought the man had retired quietly, but it seemed men like Kade never truly left the battlefield. They simply changed the arena. Downstairs, Kade ordered his men to fan out and keep the exit secured. Hayes is old, but he is not slow. Do not underestimate him. His tone was not mocking. It was clinical, the tone of a man who understood Daniel's instincts because he had helped shape them. Elias leaned in close. If Kade wants you alive, it is not mercy. It is strategy. The attic creaked slightly as someone stepped into the hallway below. Elias pulled Daniel back into the shadows. Daniel felt the weight of the bag containing the letters and photograph pressing against his ribs, reminding him why he was here. Elias whispered, We need to move before they reach the attic ladder. Daniel glanced at the ceiling entrance, knowing once a flashlight hit it, they would have seconds at most. They crawled toward the rear of the attic, where an old storage hatch led into the neighbor's garage. Elias worked at the rusty latch with quiet urgency. Daniel listened to the footsteps moving around below, hearing the shifts in tone as Kade questioned his men with methodical precision. The colonel's voice carried a certainty that came from believing every man in the room obeyed him. The hatch finally gave way with a soft snap. Elias pushed it open, revealing darkness and dust below. Before Daniel could climb down, Kade's voice rose again from below the attic. Hayes, I know you are here, and I know you can hear me. Elias froze mid-movement, eyes widening. Daniel felt the attic shrink around him, walls closing in with every word from the man beneath them. Kade continued, You deserved a quiet life. I gave you that. I protected it for decades because you stayed in your lane, but tonight you stepped out of it. His tone remained calm, almost gentle. And when men step out of lanes someone built for them, they become liabilities. Elias mouthed a single word to Daniel. Move. Daniel clenched his jaw and lowered himself through the hatch. Elias followed, pulling the panel shut above them just as one of Kade's men tapped the attic entrance with a baton. They hit the floor of the neighbor's garage quietly, crouched between stacks of old boxes. Elias pressed a finger to his lips and pointed toward the small window on the far wall. Daniel nodded, but his mind kept replaying Kade's words. Someone had built a lane for him, and he had walked it blindly. As they slid along the garage wall, Daniel whispered, "He has been watching me. For years." Elias gave a grim nod. "You were the only survivor. Of course he watched you." Daniel felt the betrayal deepen. "Then he knew I blamed myself. He let me believe I failed them." Elias stopped for a moment, looking Daniel directly in the eyes. "That guilt made you quiet, and quiet men are easy to manage." They reached the window and pried it open. Outside was a narrow strip of yard leading toward the end of the street. Elias climbed out first, then helped Daniel through. They had barely touched the ground when the neighbor's porch light flicked on. The two men froze. The porch door opened slightly, and a silhouette appeared, an elderly woman in a house robe holding a phone. Her voice trembled. "Daniel, why are there men with guns in your house?" Daniel stepped forward, raising a hand gently. "Margaret, you need to go back inside. Please, lock your doors." She stumbled back a step, fear spreading across her face. Elias whispered urgently, "We cannot stay here." Daniel nodded and guided Margaret inside for her own safety, then sprinted across the yard with Elias at his side. As they reached the back fence, the sound of a voice echoed again, amplified through the night. Colonel Kade had stepped onto Daniel's porch with a handheld mic. "Hayes," Kade called out, "running will only make this worse. I am not your enemy, not unless you choose to make me one." Elias grabbed Daniel's arm tightly. "Ignore him. He lies like he breathes." But Daniel could not ignore the way Kade's calm voice controlled the night. It was the same voice that had once ordered them into the valley. The same voice that told them help was coming. The same voice that went silent when the explosion started. Daniel felt his breath hitch as memories flashed, shouting, "Smoke!" The weight of a dying soldier in his arms. The sky turning orange with fire. "Daniel!" Elias shook him. "Stay with me. They are spreading around the block." Daniel blinked the memories away. "We need a place to hide." Elias nodded. "I know one, but we must get off the street." They vaulted the fence and dropped into an alley behind the houses. Elias led Daniel through the maze of narrow paths until they emerged behind an abandoned plumbing store at the edge of town. The place was boarded up, forgotten, and perfect for disappearing. They slipped through a broken side door and into a room full of old pipes and dust-covered shelves. Daniel leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. "How long has Kade been part of this?" Elias scanned the room, then answered, "Longer than you think. He was not just your commanding officer. He was one of the architects. The mission was his, the sacrifice was his, and your silence was his." Daniel felt the rage building again, a slow burn that threatened to erupt. Elias continued, "The truth does not end with us. There are others who survived pieces of it. Fragments of the operation. Enough to prove Kade orchestrated more than one cover-up." Daniel looked up sharply. "Others?" Elias nodded. "But to find them, we need one thing. The classified coordinates you kept." Daniel slowly raised the bag containing the documents. "Then we have them." Elias allowed himself one brief, exhausted smile. "Then we are not dead yet." Before Daniel could respond, something clattered outside the plumbing store. Metal hitting concrete. Elias raised a hand, signaling silence. They crouched behind a counter as footsteps approached. Daniel held his breath, knowing Kade's men were thorough and relentless. Elias reached into his coat and retrieved a small knife, his only weapon besides his resolve. The footsteps stopped directly outside the broken door. Someone exhaled softly, then whispered into a radio, "I found tracks. 2 sets. Fresh." Daniel's heart pounded in his ears. He clenched the bag of documents tighter, knowing everything they needed to expose the truth was inside it. Elias mouthed, "Be ready." The shadow at the door grew darker as the man stepped inside. Daniel held his breath. Elias tightened his grip on the knife. The intruder moved closer, sweeping a flashlight across the room. The beam drew nearer and nearer to where Daniel and Elias were hiding. Then the radio crackled. A voice spoke. A voice that made Daniel's stomach drop. It was Kade. "Do not kill Hayes. Bring him to me." The man hesitated. Then he whispered back, "And the other one?" There was a long pause. Too long. Long enough to reveal everything Daniel needed to know about the cruelty hidden behind Kade's calm voice. Colonel Kade finally answered, "Elias is no longer required." The flashlight swung toward their hiding spot as Elias mouthed one final warning. "Whatever happens, you run." The moment Colonel Kade said Elias was no longer required, the night stopped being a chase and became an execution plan. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, slicing closer to where Daniel and Elias crouched behind the counter. Daniel felt his pulse hammering against the documents pressed to his chest. each heartbeat a reminder that he carried the last unbroken piece of a buried truth. Elias's face was calm, but his eyes held the grim understanding of a man who knew someone had already decided how his story should end. The intruder stepped forward with steady boots, sweeping the beam across shelves and boxes. Elias leaned in close to Daniel and whispered, "If he sees us, you run. Do not argue." Daniel tightened his grip on the bag, shaking his head, but Elias's expression hardened. "You still have something to protect." "I do not." The man's light reached the edge of the counter. Daniel could see the silhouette of his weapon angled forward, finger resting lightly on the trigger. Elias raised the knife slowly, ready to strike if needed. The air was tight enough to snap as the beam began to crawl up the side of the counter, inches away from exposing them completely. Before the intruder rounded the corner, a loud crash from outside the shop shattered the silence. Someone had knocked over a trash bin in the alley. The man jerked his head toward the sound, stepped back, and whispered into his radio. Possible movement outside. Checking perimeter. He exited the shop quickly, leaving only the fading beam of his flashlight as proof he had been there. Elias exhaled quietly and touched Daniel's shoulder. "We cannot stay here. Once they sweep again, they will find us." Daniel nodded, but his hands shook with adrenaline. "Where do we go?" he whispered. Elias listened to the fading footsteps and said, "Somewhere they will not expect. Somewhere even Kade hates." They slipped out through the rear of the shop, keeping low as they crossed the alley toward a narrow service tunnel leading beneath the old town square. Daniel felt his breath cold in his chest as he asked, "Why does Kade want me alive?" Elias replied, "Because your name carries weight. Because the medal they gave you became a symbol too big to erase quietly." Daniel frowned. "Then why does he want you dead?" Elias paused, a shadow crossing his face. "Because I know what they built that prototype to do, and I know who they sold the design to afterward." Daniel felt the ground tilt beneath him. "Sold? To who?" Elias shook his head. "If I tell you here, you will freeze. You need to hear it when you can actually run." They reached the rusted grate covering the service tunnel entrance. Elias pried it open and motioned Daniel inside. The tunnel was cramped and silent, but at least it was hidden. As they moved deeper, Daniel whispered, "Elias, did you always know Kade would come for me?" Elias hesitated before answering. "I hoped we had more time. I was wrong." Halfway through the tunnel, Elias stopped abruptly and raised a hand. Daniel froze. A faint echo drifted down the corridor, metal scraping, footsteps, and the unmistakable click of a weapon being readied. Daniel whispered, "They found the tunnel." Elias nodded once. "They always do." The footsteps grew louder. Daniel held the bag tighter, feeling the letters inside shift slightly. Those letters were the last testimonies of men who died, believing they were serving a noble mission. Elias placed himself between Daniel and the sound. "If they box us in, I will hold them long enough for you to run." Daniel shook his head fiercely. "I'm not leaving you again." Elias's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Daniel, the night you thought I died, I heard you call my name. You did not fail me. You tried. But tonight, if you stay and we both fall, then everything dies with us." Daniel felt a pain in his chest deeper than fear. "Do not ask me to repeat the past," he said. Elias offered a sad, grateful smile. "Then make a different choice this time. Live." A voice echoed down the tunnel, cold, steady, unmistakable. "Hayes." Daniel's blood froze. Colonel Kade had entered the tunnel personally. His footsteps were slow, confident, measured like a man walking through a place he already owned. "You are cornered," Kade called out. "There is nowhere left to run." Elias whispered, "He is baiting you. Do not speak." Daniel pressed himself against the wall, heart pounding. Kade's voice grew closer. "Hayes, you do not understand what you are carrying. That bag is not just evidence, it is leverage. The kind that gets entire nations nervous." Daniel whispered back to Elias, "What does he mean?" Elias breathed out, "The prototype. It worked. And it was replicated." Daniel felt sick. "How many?" Elias closed his eyes. "Enough to matter." Kade's footsteps stopped just beyond the bend. "Elias," he said calmly, "I know you are here. I know you convinced him to run, and I know exactly where you are headed." Elias whispered, "He is guessing. Do not panic." But the confidence in his voice cracked slightly. Then Kade's tone hardened. "Hayes, if you take one more step, you will cross a line I cannot let you cross. I will not kill you, but I will take you. And no one will ever hear from you again." Daniel's breath hitched. The sharp certainty in Kade's words felt like a chain tightening around his throat. Elias leaned in close, whispering with urgent clarity. He wants you alive because he needs to control the narrative. He wants me dead because I know the one detail he cannot afford to leak. Daniel swallowed hard. What detail? Elias whispered, I know who gave the final order to leave us to die. Before Daniel could react, a sudden thundering sound shook the tunnel. A metal door at the far end slammed open, flooding the passage with harsh white light. Figures entered 3, maybe 4 silhouettes, moving with military precision. Elias hissed. They flanked us. Kade's voice came again from behind them. Enough running, both of you. Stop. Daniel spun, trapped between 2 approaching teams. The tunnel shrank into a coffin-sized corridor of shadows and concrete. Elias stepped in front of him, shoulders squared, ready to die if it meant Daniel escaped with the truth. Daniel's breaths came fast, each one sharper than the last. All exits were blocked. All choices were lethal. He clutched the bag tighter, knowing the letters inside were the last remaining truth. Elias whispered, When I move, you run left. Daniel whispered back, No. Elias gave him a single fierce look. Yes. And before Daniel could protest again, Elias moved. Elias lunged toward the advancing silhouettes, but before he reached them, a single gunshot echoed through the tunnel, and Daniel saw Elias's body jerk violently in the harsh white light. Elias collapsed before he hit the ground, and in that one brutal second, Daniel understood that the truth was about to demand a final price. The gunshot echoed through the tunnel like a verdict, sending dust drifting through the white beam of the intruder's lights. Daniel lunged toward Elias, catching him before he fell completely. Elias's breath rattled, shallow and broken, and he gripped Daniel's shirt with the last strength he had left. Kade stepped forward with the calm authority of a man used to ending things. Hayes, he said softly, you were not meant to see this. You were meant to live quietly. Daniel looked up at him with eyes filled not with fear, but with something heavier clarity. I am done living the life you chose for me. Elias tightened his grip on Daniel's collar, pulling him closer. Listen, Elias whispered, struggling through the pain. You asked what I knew. The final order. The one that left us to die that night. Daniel leaned in, hearing Elias's voice fade like a candle in wind. Elias whispered one name, quiet, absolute, devastating. Daniel froze. His expression tightened. The truth was worse than betrayal. It was familiar. Kade knelt beside them with a sigh. So he told you. I had hoped he would not. Daniel whispered. Why? Kade replied. Because the moment you know, you stop being manageable. Daniel felt a calm anger spread through him, the kind that does not shout or tremble. He touched Elias's face gently as Elias's eyes dimmed, fading into a final stillness. Kade watched with a soldier's detached regret, then said, Come with me. We can fix this. Daniel stood slowly, the bag of documents hanging from his shoulder like a weight he had carried his entire life. Fixing it, he said quietly, starts with telling the truth. Kade shook his head. Truth kills nations, Hayes, Daniel replied. It already killed my brothers. The men surrounding Daniel stepped forward, expecting resistance. But Daniel simply raised both hands. I will go, he said. But the truth goes with me. Kade hesitated, uncertain whether this was surrender or strategy, but he nodded for his men to take Daniel into custody. What none of them noticed was the tiny recording device clipped inside Daniel's jacket activated the moment the gunshot hit Elias. Elias had placed it there earlier, a silent backup plan Daniel never knew existed. It contained everything. Kade's words, the order, the cover-up, the truth. Elias had ensured the truth would live even if he did not. 2 days later, the recording leaked. Not to the press, not to officials, but to veterans groups, local leaders, and eventually the families of the men who died. It spread quietly, organically, like a truth that refused to die again. Investigations opened, names were questioned, careers collapsed, and through it all, Daniel stayed silent. He visited Elias's grave alone at dusk. He placed the rare medal on the headstone, letting it rest there like a fallen leaf. You earned this, he whispered. I only carried it. Daniel walked away without taking a single picture or telling a single story. Because the truth was finally free, and Elias had given his life not for glory, but for honesty. And Daniel understood what he had never understood before. Some honors live loud, but the real ones do not need witnesses. True honor never needs to be spoken aloud, because the men who carry it already paid its price. If you've listened this far, type 1 in the comments, so I know you're here with me.